Hello, Blogging Heads audience. This is Conn Carroll, the Heritage Foundation. Today we are going to be talking to Charles Johnson of Little Green Footballs to get kind of a background of what he's been up to, and more specifically, why, as I guess his now infamous, famous post reads, why I parted ways with the right. Welcome, Charles.
Hi, Conn. Nice to be here.
It is always fun to talk to someone new. So I guess before we get into the meat and into your post, I wanted to familiarize who you are with those of the blogging audience who aren't familiar with your work. You, of course, have been blogging and have had a widely read blog for a long time, for coming on a decade now, no?
Yes, close to, I guess, almost 9 years now.
And I think possibly before this last post, you were probably most famous for being one of the first ones to produce a 2004 MS Word document that, of course, matched up to the George Bush National Guard Dan Rather memos, correct?
Right, that's right. That was kind of, Little Green Footballs was actually pretty popular before that because I'd focused on the threat of radical Islam following the 9/11 attacks.
Right. I didn't mean to suggest otherwise. I'm just saying as far as a nugget for people to remember you by. I think that scandal would probably be the most headline worthy.
Yeah, definitely. That got a lot of notice, obviously, from a lot of people. Although oddly, CBS News never did contact me about it.
Oh yeah?
No, I never heard from anyone at CBS.
I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong here, or maybe you don't know, but I believe my coworker, Robert Bluey, who worked for CNS News at the time, who is credited, at least on Wikipedia, which is always true, as being one of the first print mainstream journalists, non-bloggers basically, to pick up on the story. Mm-hmm. Him being one of your readers. Is that your understanding of it? I mean, where did you come in that story as far as how far along was the story? Were you one of the first ones to cast doubts on the memo? Or
I was one of the first ones. I believe the first person to notice that there was something strange about those documents was a poster on Free Republic who used the name Buckhead. And at that time, I happened to... I was looking around different blogs the morning after the CBS show was aired, which I believe was Thursday morning, and I noticed that Powerline had a post that linked to the Buckhead post at Free Republic, mentioning that there was something screwy about those documents, something that didn't look right, and so that kind of piqued my interest because I have a computer background and I know quite a bit about programming, and so I went over to the CBS site and I downloaded the documents. They'd posted them in PDF form, and as soon as I opened them up in Acrobat Reader, I realized there was absolutely no way that these had been created with a typewriter in the 1970s. So from there, it really just snowballed.
So you just knew right away by looking at it, and then it was just a matter of finding out, which modern computer programming software they used, right?
Yeah, well, I knew instantly. I mean, it was obvious to me because I used to be the co-owner of a software company, and some of the software that we sold was word processing software that used computer fonts, and so I had quite a bit of background in this kind of display technology, and I realized instantly that there's no way this was created on a typewriter. For lots and lots of reasons, not just the fact that the lettering was kerned, as a lot of people like to focus on, but there were many indicators. And then, since I knew instantly that was the case, I then went and I decided to just try to see what would happen if I opened up Microsoft Word and just started typing the same document. And it blew my mind because it was obvious that this was created in Microsoft Word, because as I typed one of those documents in, it was an absolutely perfect match.
So the forgers didn't even really put that much effort into it?
No, it was they just opened up Microsoft Word, used the default settings, and typed away. When I say perfect match, I mean every aspect of it was perfect. The spacing was perfect. The space between the lines was perfect. The line breaks. You know how when you're typing in a word processor, you have automatic line breaks.
Right.
Well, when you're on a typewriter, obviously you don't get that nice little feature. And all the line breaks matched up perfectly. All the character spacing was perfect, and it was really an eye opener. I remember chills going down my spine when I did this, actually, because it was so obviously a fake.
So let's kind of pick that up. So you started your blog in 2000, roundabout then?
Yeah, actually, it was started at the beginning of 2001.
So pre 9/11.
Yeah, it was started before 9/11. I believe February of 2001,
And before that, or I guess still now, you were what was your background in? What were you doing professionally?
Well, I have kind of a varied career. I've been a musician, and I'm a guitar player, and I've played with a lot of pretty well-known jazz musicians such as Al Jarreau, Stanley Clarke, George Duke, and I have 2 gold records and 1 platinum hanging on the wall. So I had a fairly successful music career.
So you're kind of like John Amato, like that, of Crooks and Liars, a musician in L.A. turned to blogger.
Yeah, I guess you could say so. But in addition to that, I also became a computer programmer. I was a self-taught computer programmer, just like I was a self-taught musician. And I formed a company that marketed mostly utility software for Atari ST computers. And so I had both of those careers going. And I think a lot of musicians find it pretty easy to get into computer programming. There's something about the 2 disciplines that complement each other pretty well.
So let's slowly transition into your post. Before 9/11, when you first started the blog, did you consider yourself of the right?
Absolutely not. If you go back and look at the kinds of things I was writing about before 9/11, you'll discover that I was not very positive towards George W. Bush. And in fact, in the 2000 election, I voted for Al Gore. And before that, I voted for Bill Clinton. So I'd always thought of myself as not a far left type, but I guess socially liberal, although I've always been more in line with the fiscal conservative ideals.
Okay, fair enough. So you consider yourself a socially liberal, fiscally conservative, independent-minded, pretty non-political guy.
Definitely independent. I wouldn't say I'm non-political anymore. I can't really say that.
Well,
because,
I'm talking about you then.
Yeah, back then I was pretty apolitical, although leaning more toward the left than the right, and you'll find that I wrote some actually pretty mean things about George W. Bush.
Well, that's okay. I've written some pretty mean things about George W. Bush myself.
Right. I think most of us have at this point.
So 9/11 happens, and at some point between 9/11 and the time you wrote your Goodbye from the Right post, you considered yourself a member of the right. Could you say how or when that happened, or both?
You know, I would say that I used to fight against being classified as right-wing. In fact, again, if you go back and look at some of the things I wrote in the early days of Little Green Footballs, you'll see that I used to really protest against being classified that way. But
who in the early days would stick such a terrible label upon you?
Well, you know, anyone who is in favor of a strong foreign policy and sort of, I guess you might call it hawkish, would, you know, they're going to get classified as right wing by a lot of people, and you really can't avoid that. And for me, I think what happened was that I realized that no matter what I did and what I said, I was going to be put in that bag anyway. So I stopped protesting about it, but I never really was comfortable with it.
Fair enough. But then, like you said, when it came time, I guess we'll fast forward to 2004, and you saw the Dan Rather story came out. You said you looked on Powerline and saw that they had linked to the Free Republic, and you started looking at some Free Republic diaries. Were you regular simpaticos with the power line guys?
Well, at that point, yes. I was a pretty regular reader of that blog and several other right-wing blogs because I guess I felt that the left wing had kind of fallen down on the job after 9/11 and bought into a whole bunch of far left ideas that I didn't agree with anymore. And so I tended,
for example.
Well, the idea that one of the things that came out almost immediately was this idea that we deserved to be attacked because of our foreign policy. And in fact, we had several people at my site who were posting comments about that. And I remember feeling greatly offended and just completely outraged that anyone could think that airplanes full of people, women, children, men who were just, on their business deserve to die because of America's foreign policy. And I mean, from my point of view, America had done a lot that was valuable and laudable in the world, and it was outrageous to me. And I felt at that point that the so-called left wing had pretty much left me, not that I'd left them.
So just. Anything policy specific other than a rejection of the idea that we deserved it?
Well, they weren't in power then. It was George W. Bush in office.
That's true.
So,
that's true.
So I don't think that there was really much that they had to do with the policies at the time. And I pretty much approved of Bush's response, although I had some reservations about the Iraq War.
But correct me if I'm wrong, you were generally in favor of the invasion.
Yes. I was, and I remain generally in favor of it, although it had a lot of unforeseen consequences, I think. But
well, that's okay. There's plenty on the left, many bloggers on the left like Matthew Iglesias and Ezra Klein, etc., who are in the same boat as you are.
Right. Yeah, I think that I think in general we are much better off without Saddam Hussein in power in Iraq, although. Obviously, there's a big mess there now that's going to have to be handled in some way.
Fair enough. So, definitely in 2004, you felt motivated enough to track down these documents and defend George W. Bush.
Honestly, I didn't see it as defending George W. Bush. What I saw it as was debunking something that was just an obvious fraud to me. I mean, that was really what I was focused on. It wasn't so much defending Bush, because I think there actually was evidence that he got favorable treatment in the Texas National Guard. That wasn't the issue for me. And in fact, I kind of assumed that would be the case with most well-connected young men, especially someone who is the son of a president. So. Or at that time, I guess he was not the president, but more of a
someone well connected in D.C.
Definitely well connected, and it didn't really surprise me that he would have gotten favorable treatment. But really, the focus for me was just that someone out there was trying to perpetrate a fraud on the American public and trying to skew a presidential election with fraudulent documents, and that remains the big issue for me. And I'm honestly a little bit shocked and surprised that no one in the media has ever really followed up on this.
Do we know who created the memos, or
no?
Still
in fact,
to this day?
It remains a mystery to this day. I mean, there are some suspects. Bill Burkett, I believe, is the most obvious suspect, but it was never actually traced to him and proven. And see, this is where I think the media has really fallen down on this, because it's a huge story when someone tries to tilt a presidential election. So I'm really kind of amazed that no one has followed up on this, and I think maybe the reason for it is because it would be pretty embarrassing to the media to really dig into this.
So at this point, you probably still accepted being called a person of the right, though, correct?
Well, yeah, grudgingly.
And when did that start to change?
To be honest, it was like I said, it was never something I was comfortable with. But really, after Barack Obama was elected, I think that the right has taken a direction that I just really cannot agree with anymore. And
so Obama's election or the campaign? Because it was a long campaign.
The campaign was a different matter. I mean, there was a lot that came out during the campaign, and everyone was hyper-partisan at that point. I mean, that's just the way it goes during a presidential campaign. And I was probably just as much as anyone else. So
who were you hyper-partisan for at the time?
Well, at that time, I was in favor of McCain.
Okay.
Yeah, I came out. Actually, during the campaign, during the primaries, I was more in favor of Rudy Giuliani than John McCain. And in fact, I wrote a post after Giuliani and Romney pulled out of the race, leaving McCain as the only contender, predicting that if McCain was the candidate, that Barack Obama would be president. And sure enough, look what happened.
But you still were pretty, I don't know if it's forceful. You definitely defended McCain from some more
yes.
conservative members of the blogosphere.
Yes, I do think that McCain got a raw deal in some respects. But to be honest, I started to really lose faith in him after he picked Sarah Palin as his running mate.
What about Sarah Palin in particular? Was it right away you did not like her, or what?
To be honest, when she was originally picked for vice presidential candidate, I really didn't know much about her. And of course, at that point, a lot of the information that was coming out about her was sanitized through the McCain campaign. But as I learned more about her, and as she gave her interviews, especially the notorious one with Katie Couric and the one with Charlie Gibson, I was very much disappointed to learn that she stood for some things that I could not stand for. So she made several statements that I saw as being openly anti-science, for example, and that's a big issue for me.
Okay. Well, let's go ahead and use that as a pivot to talk about your post, which was November 30th of this year,
right.
Titled "Why I Parted Ways with the Right." You have 10 reasons why, a good round number. Do you want to go ahead, since it's your post, read them off one by one, then we can go back?
Sure. First, I just want to mention that this post really wasn't intended to cause any kind of a huge bombshell. What happened was I was sitting there at about 7 o'clock at night, and I realized that a lot of things I've been writing over the past year had really been weighing on my mind, and the whole post came out in, I'd say, 3 or 4 minutes. I really didn't labor over it at all. It was as if it had been sitting in my subconscious and needed to be expelled from the subconscious into the blogosphere. And sure enough, so I wrote down.
Well, let's go ahead and talk about that. Was there a specific incident, or because like you said before, you had long fought the label being labeled a person of the right.
Yes.
And so then why? What made you feel the need to formally announce that you're no longer with them?
It had kind of been building for quite a while. It started, I think, when I began to really criticize the creationist wing of the Republican Party, and especially the overwhelming support for this, what I see as a Dark Ages anti-science view. And I was actually shocked when I began to write about creationism at my blog to find out how many people who were readers of my blog were advocates of creationism. I didn't realize that it was so widespread until I started to write about it more in depth.
So was there a comment at your blog on some specific post, or?
Oh, there were hundreds, thousands of comments, I'd say. It kind of started when after Ben Stein put out his movie Expelled.
Right.
And I went to see the movie. Up to that point, I'd been kind of a fan of Ben Stein's columns because he was pro-military and very good on foreign policy, I thought. And I always liked his show Win Ben Stein's Money. So I I went to see the movie, and I was just absolutely appalled because, as someone who's always had a sort of a techie bent and been interested in science, actually at one time I considered a career in science, but couldn't. I had a music career that kind of pulled me away from it. But I was absolutely appalled to see this movie and realize that Ben Stein was equating Darwinism with Hitler and Nazism and all kinds of I thought, totally scurrilous accusations that needed to be rebutted. So I wrote a post about this, and if I go back now, I think I had over 4,000 comments for that one post, and huge battles erupted between readers, and a lot of people who, up to that point, I think had assumed that I was all on board with the social conservative, anti-evolution talking points of the right wing, found out that I was not.
Fair enough. I have a number of friends who also are. I, for one, also am not a creationist, and
I'm glad to hear that.
Believe in evolution. But I also have many friends growing up in the Bay Area who feel very strongly about the issue, like you do. Mm-hmm. And I'm always puzzled as to why it becomes so determinative for them. Because when we look at the issues of the day, whether it's the surge in Afghanistan, Iraq, healthcare, cap and trade, I never really figure out how creationism really figures into all this.
Well, for me, it comes down to an outlook on the world that I think affects and bleeds over into all of those other areas. For example, if you look at the people who promote creationism, and really, let's not mince words, what they really want to do is to teach this belief to all people's children. They constantly try to sneak it into schools across the nation. I mean, there are efforts going underway in several states right now to introduce intelligent design creationism in science classes. And for me, I think this is a really, really bad influence on America. Science education is vital in the modern world, in my view, and it's very important.
And so it's your belief that the big barrier between the American people and a good science education are creationists?
Not just creationists. It's a whole worldview that I think is often promoted by the religious right.
Because when I think of a inner city kid in Oakland, California, where I grew up, at Oakland Tech, who is getting a very terrible science education, creationists have absolutely nothing to do with it.
Oh, it's not the only determining factor. Don't get me wrong. I'm not
even saying it's the only one. I'm saying it's like 1,000th on the list. Like it's at the very, very bottom and is basically irrelevant.
I disagree. I don't think it's irrelevant at all. I think it's a symptom of a general anti-science orientation that is heavily promoted by the religious right, and it also bleeds over into, for example, the climate change debate. I've discovered that many of the same people who promote creationism in schools are also the same ones who deny that humans cause global warming. And I think it all ties in together with a certain outlook on the world that's sort of atavistic and backward, instead of embracing science and using it to drive policy, which is what I think we really need to do in this country. Because we
had a very small technical malfunction. We lost Charles when I was talking about my worries about creationists on the right. And basically, the short version being that I worry that they will see the world as perfect the way God created it, and that therefore allowing the government to come in and regulate the economy so that the world stays just as it is without man changing it is bad for liberty, economic growth, etc. So then I was going to ask Charles if he sees similar problems with creationists along those lines, or if he only has the one narrower view of the problem with creationism and global warming.
Well, actually, I kind of disagree with that assessment.
Go for it.
Because from what I've seen, the religious right tends to believe that since God created the world, man if man does anything to affect it, it really isn't going to change anything. In other words, they believe that since God created the world perfectly, only God can do anything to cause global warming, and that man has nothing to do with it. And they use that as an excuse to do nothing, not to actually regulate things. I think the majority, in fact, you can see there have been several right-wing politicians who pretty openly expressed that view exactly. James Inhofe is one, for example, who pretty much believes that since God created the world, he is the only one who can destroy it, and that therefore man has nothing to do with it, and there's no need to even do anything to combat global warming.
There are definitely some people on the right that believe that. I just have also seen a growing belief, especially if you look at the polling among younger evangelicals, younger people who believe in creationism, of more of the mindset that I describe of being caretakers of the earth, and that
I have seen some of that. Yeah, I have seen some of that. There's a group called Creation Care, I believe, that does espouse that kind of view. But what they're talking about is not really the same kind of measures to fight against global warming that scientists are advocating. They're talking about something that's much more religiously oriented and not really effective in any way.
But as the evangelical movement is having their own evolution on their beliefs in climate change, you have also had changes in your view of climate change, correct?
Yes, definitely. I've written about this. In fact, there was a point at which I had pretty much accepted much of the propaganda that comes from the denial industry. And there are groups in America that are specifically dedicated to spreading disinformation about climate change. And I pretty much accepted it. For example, I read Michael Crichton's book, State of Fear, which was basically a long polemic that was advocating against any action on climate change. And, reading that and seeing all the footnotes, it looks very authoritative. But and there was another thing that was kind of a turning point for me. There was a movie that was made in Great Britain, a documentary called The Great Global Warming Swindle. And when it first came out, I looked at it and I thought, oh, look at this. They really are trying to hoax us. This is terrible. They're lying to us. And then after I posted the movie at my blog and wrote quite a bit about it, I started to read some scientific responses to this movie and realized that not only was there a lot of mistaken information in it, there was a lot of information that was deliberately false and that had been distorted and misrepresented. And I think that was a real big turning point for me.
What about when the British Supreme Court said that there was enough false information in An Inconvenient Truth that the British school system could not show that movie? Did that affect your thinking at all?
That actually was... I didn't look into that much at the time, but I've looked back at it now, and it turns out that that's been sort of misrepresented. I'd have to go back and look at this to get all the details for you, but it turns out that Gore's movie was not exactly banned in Britain.
I didn't say it was banned in Britain. I said it was not allowed to be shown in classrooms.
Not allowed to be shown in schools. Yeah, actually, it is allowed to be shown in schools. If you
not as science.
Into this, you'll find. I don't know. Like I say, I'm not really up on all the talk about this, but
they can show Romeo and Juliet in the schools if they want. They just can't show it as an accurate depiction of history. And you can show Inconvenient Truth. You just can't call it science.
Right. Well, I'm not up on that.
Well,
so
we'll post the decision from the British High Court is online. We can post that, and viewers can take a look to see what Al Gore's relationship with the truth is really like.
I'm less concerned about Al Gore. To be honest, Al Gore is just a politician.
Okay, so then let's.
He's a spokesman for it, but he's not the one who really does the research, and the research is what convinced me.
Okay, so what has the research convinced you of exactly?
Well, when I realized, for example, that the Great Global Warming Swindle had been so distorted and so misrepresented, that it so misrepresented the science of climate change, I decided that since this was obviously going to be a very big issue, I would start to educate myself on the matter. And this is what I've always done. I get very kind of obsessive about these sort of things, and I tend to really dive into it in depth. And I started to read all kinds of books and scientific papers, and I looked at a lot of websites that deal with climate change and a lot of magazines and as many sources as I could get my hands on. And actually, Al Gore's film was not one of them. I didn't even watch this until just a few days ago. So that had very little effect on my change of heart here. And I realized the more I read on this subject, the more I just simply couldn't deny the evidence anymore. There are mountains.
The evidence of what exactly?
That man is pumping so much CO2 into the atmosphere that it's having a drastic effect on the Earth's climate. We are now way over the top limit of CO2 in the atmosphere that we've ever seen on the planet, except maybe if you go back to the Cretaceous era. So I think we're playing with fire. We're tampering with a very complex system, and things can change much faster than anyone realizes.
So it just seems to me you swung from such an extreme from it's an absolute myth to therefore. Actually, we haven't even got to therefore what. Therefore what? We should have a carbon tax. We should have the Waxman-Markey cap and trade bill or the Kerry-Boxer cap and trade bill. What's the punchline here?
To be honest, I think cap and trade is a pretty useless piece of legislation.
Well, at least we can agree on that.
To make people feel good. I think it's not going to really do anything to affect the matter. It's really it's sponsored by business for a reason, because business stands to profit.
We can agree on that too.
So it's not an effective.
So far, you're not really breaking with the right on this issue. What exactly is the policy punchline where you have broken with your former brethren on the right?
This is, policy is not really my focus on this matter, because I think that there's so much disinformation being pumped into the national debate that, for me, it's more important to get people to understand the facts of the matter before we can really begin to talk about policy. Because if people are misled and confused, which is exactly the purpose of many of these groups, then it's pointless to start talking about policy. They're not going to listen to you. They're going to just say, well, you're trying to get us to take all these draconian measures, and it's all false. It's all a hoax. But it's not a hoax. And I think ultimately what's going to have to happen is going to be quite a bit farther beyond cap and trade. This is my objection to cap and trade. Not that it's purely ineffective, but that it's way, way too little to affect the problem.
So I haven't read a thorough combing of your blog, but I'm guessing then you also attack those groups and politicians on the left that blame global warming for Katrina and hurricanes and increased damage from natural disasters, even though there's absolutely no scientific evidence that that has happened.
That's pretty hard to, it's hard to pin down the effect of global warming on any one particular disaster, for example, Hurricane Katrina.
But the left and politicians on the left still do that.
Well, yeah, because it's politicized. Okay. But, no, I don't think it's necessarily okay. I think that both sides are overly politicizing the issue, and that's, for me, one of the big problems here, is that there's so much political noise going on. That people are confused and unsure of exactly where the facts are. And this is why I've been trying to, if you look at what I post on the issue, I really focus not so much on policy, but on the actual scientific facts that people need to know.
Fair enough. So we covered creationism and science and global warming. That's one of 10. What are the list of your top 10 reasons why you left the right do you want to cover next?
Well, there are quite a few reasons, and in addition to creationism and anti-science, and this goes a little bit further also than just global warming and creationism, the anti-science thing. This is a really big issue for me. there's a resistance to scientific research that is really ingrained in a lot of the right, and especially on the far right and the religious right. And this is a big problem. I've also been very critical of bigotry against homosexuals, which I think is also a really big issue, and it's one of the reasons why the Republican Party is losing so much support among young Americans, because young Americans are just not, they have a much more open view toward gay people and their rights. And I think that there's a sort of atavistic attitude on much of the right that is very much out of favor, and it's going to be continue to be out of favor, I think, and it's really going to affect the right wing.
On a previous Blogging Heads, Ari Melber of The Nation asked me if I believed the anti-gay marriage stance of the Republican Party would hurt them at the polls, and I've already said yes, I think it will. But let me just stick on that from a slightly different angle. What exactly do you consider homophobic bigotry? Do you consider it homophobic bigotry to be against granting contractual default rights to same-sex couples?
Not necessarily. I think there are some people who are against that for principled reasons, but I think they're in the minority. I think a lot of the response that comes from the right wing to the idea that gay people can have a contractual relationship with each other, call it marriage, call it whatever, really does stem from a kind of bigotry that is purely opposed to gay people for its own sake, and that's a real problem, and I think it is going to affect the Republican Party at the polls drastically in the years to come.
But you at least would stipulate that it's not bigoted for believers of whatever faith, or really for whatever reason, to believe that that the state does not have to recognize same-sex marriages.
I would say it's not necessarily bigoted. However, in many cases, it is bigoted. And in fact, I just wrote a post yesterday that sums up a lot of the bigotry in the Illinois senatorial race. There's a candidate named Andy Martin who recently posted an attack on his primary opponent and accused him of being part of a Republican homosexual cabal. And this is the kind of stuff that I think goes on far too often on the right wing, a sort of a fear-mongering, playing on people's fears and using that for political benefit. And this is something I just can't be on board with.
So how many of you think your former compatriots are? Like, so for example, the Power Lines, the Hot Airs, the Michelle Markins, how many of them picked up on Andy Martin's attack on Kirk and endorsed it and said that Andy Martin was right on?
I think that they ignore that stuff mostly.
Okay.
They ignore a lot of the stuff that doesn't really fit into their worldview because it's uncomfortable. But I do see on several right-wing blogs, and including some pretty popular ones. Like? For example, Gateway Pundit. He's been posting one post after another about Kevin Griffith, the Obama's education czar, I guess you could call him. And he's getting his information on this straight from the group called Mass Resistance, which is listed by the Southern Poverty Law Center as a hate group. And in fact, if you look at their website, there's pretty little doubt that they are an absolute homophobic bigotry site. I mean, it's way over the line of anything that's acceptable. They demonize homosexuals. They don't just oppose policies that would grant them rights. So and this is the kind of stuff that I really am disturbed by. It's a kind of a McCarthyistic attitude that I can't be with.
Fair enough. I don't see it happening very much. And as far as the Southern Poverty Law Center goes, they are a hate group fundraising organization. They've gotten an F from the nonprofit rating agency for keeping on reserves, and basically all they do is raise money Is all they do is raise fear about hate groups in order to survive financially. So you can take their...
I'd have to disagree again, because I mean, if I go to look at their... they've done incredibly good work on exposing some of these groups that need to be exposed.
I'll post some links to articles in the Nations and Harper blowing the lid on the Southern Poverty Law Center for the complete fraudsters they are. And the readers can look at those articles from the Nation and Harper's and judge for themselves. So we covered homophobia. We covered anti-creationism. Let's go with number one on your list, since that is the kind of the sharpest. Support for fascists both in America and in Europe. And you named Pat Buchanan twice.
Yes. Pat Buchanan is a perfect example of something that's gone really wrong on the right wing, because there was a point at which people like Buchanan had been marginalized. In fact, William F. Buckley wrote a whole book about Pat Buchanan, Pat Buchanan and Joe Sobran, to be precise. It was called In Search of Anti-Semitism, and he concluded that Buchanan was an anti-Semite.
Okay, well, let's...
After a very long and very exhaustive logical examination.
Let's go ahead and talk about Pat Buchanan, because I would agree with you that he has been marginalized on the right, and I would say that that's a good thing.
But I don't think he is marginalized anymore.
Okay.
In fact, he's been brought back into the mainstream in many ways.
By who has he been brought back into the mainstream?
Go look at the websites that publish columns by right-wing authors, for example. Town Hall, Human Events, WorldNet Daily. All of these sources publish Pat Buchanan's columns. All of them.
Where does he get his most media exposure from today?
Well, he's on MSNBC.
Which is what?
However, he is also on Fox News. In fact, he's been on Sean Hannity's show, and Sean Hannity has introduced him as the great Patrick J. Buchanan. So I don't think you can say this is purely an MSNBC thing.
Not purely, but that's definitely his main vehicle for promotion these days.
Yes, it is. And I'm sure that there's a certain part of MSNBC that loves to have Pat Buchanan on.
I agree with you.
Because he makes the right look like a bunch of paleocon throwbacks.
I agree with you.
However, it's not purely on the right, not purely on the left, I should say, because many right-wing sources still continue to publish his columns, and he has appeared often on Fox News with great, praise from people like Sean Hannity. So I disagree that he's been marginalized. I think he's actually been brought back into the mainstream. And there are other groups as well that have been brought back into the mainstream that were previously marginalized, such as the John Birch Society, which next year, in February, will be one of the co-sponsors at the CPAC convention, which I think is absolutely appalling and disgusting, and it should not be allowed to happen.
And so what has been on the reaction on the right to the John Birch Society CPAC announcement?
Pretty much nothing.
I disagree. I disagree.
I haven't seen very much commentary on this at all.
Well,
and in
I'm
fact,
guessing you haven't
at
been looking
Pajamas
for it,
Media,
because there have been notes at
Media,
the Corner or National Review, on Town Hall, even on Human Events, all calling out CPAC for legitimizing the Birchers.
But have they been disinvited?
Not to my knowledge. Although the Birch Society is just the beginning of CPAC's problems. I guess
absolutely. I agree on that.
I guess my point would be I'm not going to say that there are perfect institutions on the right and that there's not a lot of house cleaning to do in the conservative movement. There most definitely is. John Birch Society, and of course there's another big CPAC scandal this year involving whether or not the founder was in a pay-to-play scheme for UPS and the unions.
And there's also a move afoot to ban one of the gay Republican groups from CPAC, which I find extremely ironic, because they're accepting the John Birch Society but wanting to ban a gay rights group.
So CPAC definitely has their problems. However, I don't know how that makes everyone on the conservative movement a fascist, if you could explain that to me.
I don't think it does make everyone. That's not my point. I think that there's support for fascism, such as Pat Buchanan. And there's another person that I find very disturbing who's been accepted en masse on the right-wing blogosphere, who is Robert Stacey McCain, who has many ties to white supremacist organizations and neo-Nazis, in fact. So, there's a sort of acceptance of this that has become very mainstream. And to give you another example of this, at Pajamas Media, an article was posted by Ryan Morrow, pretty much criticizing CPAC for allowing the John Birch Society to attend. However, the criticism wasn't based on the fact that the John Birch Society was an illegitimate group or a racist group, which they are. The criticism was based on that allowing them to attend was politically not very smart. So it wasn't based on principle. It was based on politics, and I find that disturbing. But even more disturbing were the hundreds of comments that were posted to this article, absolutely embracing the John Birch Society and defending having them at CPAC. So, there's a lot of support for this kind of stuff on the right wing that comes from the grassroots in many cases, but it also is enabled by people at the top.
Fair enough. We're running out of time here. So we got another one, number 3 on your list, support for throwing women back into the Dark Ages. I'm wondering if you could explain that one.
Well, the point of that is basically the anti-abortion stance of much of the...
So if you're pro-life, you're for throwing women into the Dark Ages?
No, not necessarily. Again, it's not so absolute. I think that there are people who are pro-life who are not.
Absolute. These are your words, not mine.
I think there are people... I'm saying there's support for throwing women back into the Dark Ages. Not that it's universal support. But I do think that there's a lot of... Again, it comes from the religious right. There's a sort of attitude towards women that they cannot control what happens with their own bodies. And for me, as a social liberal, I find this very offensive. I'm very much pro-choice, and I think that a lot of the pro-life motivation on the right wing is purely from a religious standpoint and has no real bearing on women's rights at all.
So what would you say to someone like me who really has no religious affiliation, never has, who is pro-life? Am I also want to throw women back into the Dark Ages? What explains my retrograde opinion?
Well, I think you're mistaken. I think that you're taking women for unconscious actors who can't be trusted to make choices about their own bodies. And I think that this is very important, and I think that women deserve to have those choices. And when they don't have those choices, they will do what they need to do. And we've seen what happens in this country when abortion is made illegal. It leads to back alley abortions.
I'm actually not even pro-life from an abortion stance, although I am pro-life on that aspect. I actually come at it from the other angle. I'm anti-euthanasia, which involves both men and women. Are you also pro Dr. Kevorkian and pro-killing people?
Oh, no, absolutely not. For me, that's not at all related to my pro-choice stance. I think that people need to be able to make their own choices for their bodies. Again, this is a social liberal stance for me, and it's not. I'm not trying to say that people should be stopped from taking their own lives. I think ultimately that's the choice that everyone has to make. And if they make that choice, it's their choice, and they're going to do it regardless of whether you want them to or not. Now, you can say that we need to fight against euthanasia, but really, who's advocating euthanasia? I don't see anyone aside from Dr. Kevorkian, and he's way out on the fringe. There is no support for euthanasia.
You need to travel north, where it's legal in Oregon, and there's been ballots or proposition measures all over the West. Many have been rejected, but it passed in Oregon. So there's lots of people who are actually pro-death.
Well, pro-death, I think, is putting it a little bit too strongly. What they're in favor of is allowing people who are at the extremities of their own life to decide whether they want to continue living in a situation where it's not. They have no quality left.
And by extremities, you mean finding any doctor who will say that they're in their extremities of their own life?
I think that each person has to make their own choice, and I don't think it's up to anyone else to make a choice for someone.
So you're for suicide. As long as someone wants to end their life, no matter how healthy they are, we should let them do it.
No, I'm not for suicide. What I'm for is allowing people to make their own choices.
Which includes suicide.
If it does include suicide for a person who's at the end of their rope and has no quality of life left.
How do we know if someone's at the end of their rope?
Well, why is it our decision to make that?
It's
only their
it's either our
They're
decision
the only
to make
one
that,
who can tell
or it's
that.
their decision. And if you're pro-suicide, then you believe, if you're thinking of suicide, you believe you're at the end of your life.
Well, I think only a person who is in that state can be allowed to make that choice. I don't think anyone else should be able to step in and say, no, you need to keep living even though you're in constant pain, for example. I don't see that as being any kind of...
physical pain, emotional pain, what kind of pain? Any pain?
I think it really has to be physical pain. I wouldn't be in favor of allowing anyone to just kill themselves at the spur of the moment, but on the other hand, if someone decides to do that, how are you going to stop them? You're not going to stop them. They'll find a way to do it.
Well, the only way I'm saying we should stop them is that we should not allow them to doctor shop until they find someone with low morals enough to go ahead and write whatever script they want.
Well, when has this ever happened?
It's happening right now in Oregon.
Give me an example. Give me one case where someone is doctor shop.
But I will provide you a link to a study showing that the average number of doctors a person who's used the law in Oregon is, it's like 4 or 5. People are obviously doctor shopping in Oregon to find someone who will say that they're in the life and thus allowing them to get those scripts to commit suicide.
Okay, well, you're going to have to show me that. Again, this is not something I really focus on, so I'm not up on all these issues in Oregon. But frankly, I doubt that there's really very much of that happening. And if there is, I think there's probably extenuating circumstances for many.
Fair enough. Seems like most of the back half of your list all has to do with anti-governor lunacy, conspiracy theories, and all goes down to hatred.
That's another area that's been extremely that was previously marginalized. And again, this comes back to the John Birch Society, who's behind a lot of this stuff.
But let's go ahead and skip to number 2. Hatred for Barack Obama that go beyond simply criticizing his policies into racism, hate speech, and bizarre conspiracy theories. So I was wondering if you could tell me what exactly the Tea Party's Michelle Malkin have done that is hate speech and is bizarre conspiracy theories under President Obama that, one, they didn't do before during the campaign, and 2, they wouldn't be doing now anyways under Hillary Clinton. President Hillary Clinton. What I saw at the September 12th Tea Parties, I posted, I think, maybe 5 posts where I just put up dozens of photographs from the parties. You were here in D.C.?
That I found all over the web.
Oh, so you weren't there. This is just stuff that you found on lefty sites to defame the Tea Partiers.
No, not lefty sites. I found them at Flickr and other kinds of very popular photo sites, and I also had people sending them to me who were at the event.
People sympathetic to the cause that were sending you stuff, or people who, like you, hate the Tea Partiers?
Well, but the point is, regardless of whether they were sympathetic or not, there were hundreds and hundreds of these signs that ventured into conspiracy theories, open racism, all kinds of hate speech and bizarre anti-abortion stuff, which really had nothing to do with it. I mean, I see the Tea Parties as being sort of a grab bag of far-right causes, and a lot of the people are definitely... They're not all extremists. Again, I'm not saying that.
What do you think of that MSNBC Wall Street Journal poll that showed the Tea Party was more popular than both the Democrat and Republican parties?
This is why I can't be on the right. I mean, you're making my case for me. When the Tea Parties are so popular, more popular than the Republican Party itself,
but more popular than the Democrats. This isn't a poll of Republicans. This is a poll of all Americans, including independents. And this poll, the Tea Partiers were more popular among independents than both the Republicans and the Democrats.
The problem for me is, first of all, if you look at the organizers of the Tea Parties, a lot of these people are connected to all kinds of extremist causes and astroturf groups. For example, Americans for Prosperity, which originated as a front group for the tobacco industry. There are lots of groups behind the Tea Parties. The organizers, not just the people who attend, who I find disturbingly extreme. And for example, many of the people who organized the September 12th Tea Party were involved with this Dr. Callip, who forwarded a picture around of Barack Obama as a witch doctor with a bone through his nose. And one of the women who spoke at the Tea Party as an organizer, in fact, defended Dr. Callip, Dr. David McCallip, and defended him forwarding this picture around. So there's a sort of a sometimes tacit and sometimes not so tacit support for racism that I find very disturbing. And in fact, I think that the whole birther phenomenon, which also was very well represented at the Tea Parties, by the way, I posted dozens of pictures of people carrying birther signs. I think the birther phenomenon at its base is a racist phenomenon. I think that really what it amounts to is basically a rephrasing of go back to Africa. So I mean, for me, this is where I say that the hatred for Barack Obama crosses over into racism, and I think really a lot of the hatred for Obama does stem from a sort of suppressed racism, and so it erupts because they're not allowed. They feel uncomfortable about expressing it openly, so it erupts in other ways. For example, the birther phenomenon and all these other kinds of things that take place.
Fair enough. I don't think anything I'm going to say is going to change your mind about the Tea Partiers or people who are against President Obama. You pretty much think they're all racists.
No, I don't. No, I don't. Again, I'm saying that there are people who are against Obama based on his policies, and in fact, I don't agree with all of Obama's policies either. But I think that there are also a very large segment of the right wing who does have a racist motivation.
Fair enough. There's not much I can do to disabuse you of that. How many actual Republicans, conservatives do you know personally in your life?
Thousands, thousands. I have about 32,000 registered users at Little Green Footballs, and many of them are conservatives. And I still have a lot of conservative readers who comment frequently at the site. So I understand that there are. And believe me, I'm not saying that all conservatives are racist. I don't take that view. But what I do say is that there is a substantial contingent of the right wing that has a racist motivation for opposing Barack Obama.
Okay, I have a call from my wife at the pediatrician, so we're going to have to leave it there. Okay, talk later.